Well, welcome again, everyone. For those of you that haven't met me before, my name's Lynn Lavery and I'm the Director of Academic Consulting. Now, those of you that have met me before will know that I'm a bit of a self-confessed NVivo geek. Been using the software for my own research for 20 years now, and I've been teaching it for 18 of those. Now, despite using it for all of that time, I never seem to tire of it, which I think says a lot about the software. Something that I'm particularly passionate about is the possibilities for using NVivo for literature reviews. I think it can be an incredibly useful tool for that purpose, and I'm very much looking forward to sharing that with you today. Now, before I get underway with the content, just want to emphasise a couple of points about today's session. First of all, the webinar is designed to be a demonstration, not a teaching session. So I'm not expecting that you'll be sitting at your machines following along with me on your own copy of NVivo, nor am I expecting that you'll be an NVivo expert and know how to do all of these things by the end of the time we have. My focus today is just going to be on demonstrating how you might set up a NVivo project if you would like to use it for a literature review. Secondly, I will be presenting today with NVivo 12 for Windows. Now, NVivo 12 is the latest version of the software. I'm aware that some of you may still be on NVivo 11 and that some of you might be on NVivo for Mac. The principles that I'll be showing you today and the functionality of NVivo do apply regardless of the version you're using. It's just if you're on an earlier version or NVivo for Mac, your interface will obviously look a little bit different. Now, just a couple of things in terms of me getting to grips with who is online with me. I've got a couple of quick polls that I'd like to run. First one is around what your level of experience is with the software, and the second one is about what version you're using. So I'm just going to launch the first one of those on the screen for you. So I'm just going to leave that open for a few minutes or a minute. If you could let me know what your level of experience is with NVivo. Now, in terms of today's session, as per the course description, it is aimed at people who are familiar with the software. Those of you that are brand new will still learn a thing or two, but certainly our target audience for today is people who are familiar with the basics of the software. I've got almost everyone has popped their choice through. We've got a real spread across the group actually. Just going to leave that open for another 5 seconds, so now is your chance to vote if you haven't. Okay, I'll just close that and share it with you all. It's always nice to know who else is online with you. So we do have a few people that are brand new, and the rest of the group are spread across those other options. That's fabulous. Okay, now my next question for you is, what version are you either currently using or possibly going to use? So I'm just going to also give you a few moments to complete that. Looks like responses to that one have come in a little bit quicker. Just leave that open for another 5 seconds. And I'll close that and share it with everyone. So we've got a fair number of the group have actually moved across to the more recent versions of NVivo, which is great to see. So we've got just over half of you actually are on the latest version, and we've got a few people on Mac as well. So just a reminder, as I said before, while I will be presenting with NVivo 12, everything I cover today is relevant to both version 11 and the Mac. Just hide that so we can go back to the slides. And let's just give you a bit of an introduction as to why NVivo might be helpful for lit reviews. Now, for those of you that are already familiar with the software, the good news is that you don't really need to learn anything new in order to use NVivo for a literature review. It's just a matter of transferring what you already know to a different type of source information. For those of you that are brand new to NVivo, and there were about a third of you, I'm assuming that at the very least you know what NVivo is, i.e. it's a qualitative data analysis tool that will help you manage and code a range of different data types. Now, for those of you that are brand new to NVivo, you might like to check out the range of training courses we offer just to help yourself get up to speed, hoping that this afternoon's webinar will whet your interest in the software. Now, in terms of why you might want to use NVivo for a lit review, I think it's not overly surprising that NVivo is useful for lit reviews. An awful lot of the techniques we use for analysing qualitative data are also used to analyse literature. So while NVivo is designed for qualitative data rather than literature, obviously it's designed to analyse text, and literature is just a slightly different form of text. Now, I'm not going to go through all of the points on your screen, but I just wanted to draw your attention to the fact that these are all things we do in both literature reviews and qualitative data analysis. And they're all things I'll be showing you today in NVivo in the context of a project we've set up for a lit review. I'll start out by talking about the different types of literature you might include and how to import them. I'll then talk about how to work with literature in NVivo via coding and linking. And I'll then talk about how classifications and queries might be helpful. I'll finish off just at the end today talking about the possibilities of linking NVivo to your reference management software. So on that note, let's jump across to NVivo. And this is a project that I have specifically set up for today. The topic I've chosen for this particular lit review is transcription. I figured if you're interested in NVivo, chances are you are conducting a qualitative project. You might need to do transcription for that, so I thought it would make a good topic for our session. Now, in terms of what kind of literature you might include in NVivo, there are a number of possibilities. I think probably the main likely type of data would be PDFs of journal articles. But you might like to also do things like capture web pages and bring them into NVivo. You might import some abstracts of some of the journal articles that you've read. Might be notes that you've taken on books that you want to include. They might be in Word format, or you might bring them across from something like Evernote or OneNote. So they're all examples of types of literature that you can incorporate into an NVivo project. Just in the interest of time, I'll be only covering a few of those today. Now, this project is set up with a couple of subfolders. You can see we've got one here for abstracts and one here for journal articles. Let's start out by talking about these journal articles that we have in the project. So I think these days with technology, there's probably no good reason to not have downloaded full text versions of the journal articles that you're reading. We often have those stored in various places on our computer systems, and it's very straightforward to bring them across into NVivo. Now, in terms of what you can see in these folders, and just a note that for me personally, I like to have folders set up in my Lit Review projects for the different types of literature I'm bringing across. So this sample project here just has two set up, one for abstracts and one for journal articles, as I've said. I might have other folders for information from web pages or any of those other data types that I've just spoken about. Now, the PDFs that I'll be working with today are already preloaded in, just to save us a little bit of time. Just in terms of how these got in here, all I've done is right-clicked here in the white space, and I've asked to import items. So because this is more of a demonstration, I'm not going to be going through every single step involved. As I've said, this is more to do with getting you familiar with what a Lit Review project looks like. So having imported these PDFs, let's have a quick look at what one of them might look like. So I'll open up the Davidson item. Just might make a little bit of extra room on the screen there for us. So you can see that this is just a copy of the PDF that has been imported into our NVivo project. And if I scroll through, you'll see all of the text is sitting here. Now, one thing that I wanted to show you in particular about these PDFs once they're imported, I am actually able to select particular sections of the text here. So PDFs in NVivo can be searched in terms of you can look for particular keywords. You can also code them, which is something I'll be showing you today. Now, the reason I am able to select the text like this is because this particular PDF is OCR. And now let's talk for a moment about what that means. So essentially, you'll only be able to select and code text in a PDF if the PDF is OCR enabled. Now, OCR stands for Optical Character Recognition, and that just means that the computer recognizes the letters or characters in the document. Now, most modern documents are OCR enabled by default, but it is possible that if you're working with older scanned journal articles, they might not be enabled with that feature. Now, just to anticipate the obvious question there, if you're sitting there thinking, how do I know if a particular PDF is OCR enabled? Best way to figure that out is to try and select some text in the original PDF. If you can't select the text, then it's not OCR enabled. Now, because we're not always working with very recent literature, depending on your topic, there might well be some older journal articles that need to be included. I do want to emphasize the point that if your PDF isn't OCR enabled, you are still able to select things within it, albeit in a somewhat crude way, for want of a better way of putting that. So let's just have a look. Up on the ribbon here, you'll see that I'm currently on the text option. I'm just going to come across and select region instead. And when I come into my PDF, the cursor has changed here. So what I'm able to do now, instead of selecting the text, I'm able to select a region of the page. So I still can select a paragraph, or it might be that I want to take a few lines there. So if you have got a situation where you've got an older scanned journal article, you're unable to select the text precisely, you still can take sort of chunks of the PDF for coding purposes. So it's not ideal, but it isn't the end of the world. So I'll just close that down, seeing as we've talked about the PDFs, and I'll jump back to my original folders. One thing that I think it's really important to consider if you're planning to use NVivo for a Lit Review is exactly how much material you want to bring across to your project. NVivo projects can be quite large. The maximum capacity for an NVivo project is actually 10 gigabytes, which is pretty huge. General rule of thumb with NVivo, though, is that smaller projects are better, simply because they run faster. So I wouldn't recommend you've probably got thousands of PDFs of journal articles sitting on your system. Wouldn't recommend bringing all of them over. Be a little bit selective about what you might want to bring across. And one thing I suggest is that for the full text PDFs of articles, definitely bring across all the key ones. But for items that perhaps are a little less important, you have the option to bring across just the abstracts. So I'm just going to open up, I've got an example of what I mean here. So this is a file, this is perhaps journal articles relating to transcription that I am thinking I probably won't end up using, but I'd like to have them here just in case. So all I've actually done is created a Word file. I've got the citation at the top, and then I've got a copy of the abstract. And this is the type of thing that you can actually export very easily if you're using reference management software, such as EndNote or Zotero or any of the others. So it's just a nice little strategy to try and reduce the overall project size down, bring across the full text of anything that's absolutely key, and be a bit selective about the other items that perhaps are of lesser importance. Now, while I'm talking about the overall file size, I can see a really good question has come in around whether or not to have your lit review as a separate NVivo project or to have your literature combined with the project that stores your primary data. Now, my recommendation is that if you're using NVivo for both your lit review and your primary data analysis, it would be a great idea to have them in the same project if you can. The advantage of doing that is that once you've completed your data analysis and you're writing up the results, you will need to be discussing them in some way. And when you're discussing your results, you're often linking it back to the literature that you discussed in your lit review. So if you have your literature and your data within the same project, it makes those connections between the two much easier to make. Having said that, if you have a very large project with primary data and you also have a lot of literature, it could be that that file size is just getting a little bit on the big side, and it could well be that you want to at that point break it down into two smaller projects. So I definitely recommend starting out with trying to have primary data with your literature. If it becomes unmanageable, then it would be an easy enough process to split them out at that point. So thanks for that question, Isaac. That was useful to cover that at this point. Now, what other kinds of information might you have? A lesser known function of NVivo is something called externals. And externals are something that I don't tend to use myself on a project that is based on interview-based projects or perhaps more document-type analysis. But I do find them really, really helpful if I'm using NVivo for a literature review. Now, externals are just a place where you can take notes on the books that you read or any other sort of external item. So if you have something like a very large textbook, you probably don't want to scan and import that into NVivo. It'd be much more useful to make a few notes, and you can potentially store those notes under externals. Now I've got an example here from Pat Baisley and Christy Jackson's book on NVivo. I'm just going to open that up just to show you what that would look like. So you can see that this is really just some notes about the sections of the book that related to transcription. So externals aren't anything fancy. They're just a tool that allow you to represent items that are external to your project in some way, such as the book that you've got handily stored on your bookshelf. Now, a question that I'm often asked when I cover off externals is, surely you could actually just type your notes up to do with your books in a Word document and import that across into this files area you see here. And the answer to that is absolutely you could. So there's no reason that you have to take the notes on books that you read in this externals area. It's just a tool that NVivo provides you that you might like to use. I must say I do quite like storing my book notes in the externals space, and that's primarily because when I'm pulling up coding that I've done on my notes, I can see at a glance that it's from externals, and that's an indicator to me as to what kind of information it is. So it is my personal preference, but there's no reason that you couldn't do things the old-fashioned way, type your notes up in Word and bring them across from there. Now, the last kind of source information that I wanted to cover before we move into linking and coding is memos. So I'm just going to close down the Paisley and Jackson document. I'm going to move down on this left-hand side here to the memos folder. Now, just a note that for those of you who are still using NVivo 11, it could well be that you're having trouble locating the memos folder, and that's because you guys don't have this nice little notes area. So if you are still on NVivo 11, the place to look for memos is in the sources area. So that's just one of the minor changes they've made across 11 and 12. Now, in terms of what memos are a place to put your own thoughts and thinking. So in the context of a lit review, this might be reflections that you have on articles you're reading, perhaps a log of every action that you've taken within your NVivo project, notes of articles that you need to follow up in the library, maybe a record of what you have and haven't reviewed, that type of thing. Now, just to give you an example of that, I'm just going to come to my general folder here. You can see I've set up a number of folders for my memos. I'll talk more about those shortly. I'm just going to open up the literature review journal file here. Now, this was a project I set up a wee while ago, as you will see on see by the dates that I've got here. So this is just an example of the type of things you can enter into a lit review journal. And I must say, for me personally, I'd always liked the idea of having NVivo, or using NVivo for my lit reviews. And it wasn't until I made my first memo that I was really sold on the idea. I'm one of these people that I tend to scribble things on bits of paper as I'm working, and then I inevitably lose the bit of paper. And I really love the idea of memos, particularly for a lit review, because it means that everything is centrally stored within my project. And if I'm wanting to backtrack, have a look at something I did on a previous day, I always know where to come back to look for that. So while there are a number of things I really like about using NVivo for literature reviews, the memos feature is right up there for me. So in terms of other types of memos, it could be that you want to make some memos that are based around particular viewpoints or stances that authors have. You can see I've got an author-based folder here for that. Or it might be that you want to make some memos based on the topics that are emerging from your literature. So it's just basically an area for you to put some initial writing that might actually get incorporated later into your lit review writing. So that was all the source information that I wanted to cover as part of this quick demo. Obviously, as I said earlier, there are a range of other types of information you might include, but that will hopefully give you a little bit of a taster as to what some of the possibilities are. Now I'm just going to close this memo down, and I want to move on to talking about linking, because this is something that we tend to do a lot when we're working with literature. We're making connections across authors and across the information that we're working with. So I'll cover off linking very briefly. I'm just going to show you a couple of different kinds of links in NVivo. Then I'm going to move on to talking about coding. Now, in order to show you linking, I'm just going to open up one of these articles and find a particular point of that. So bear with me while I'm just finding the right location. This would be a great opportunity to send Andrew and Hannah a question if you have one. Here we go. That's what I was looking for. So linking is a way to record brief reflections or comments that you have. Alternatively, you can use linking to connect various items within your NVivo project itself. So as I've said, it's a possible way of making connections between authors or ideas that you're reading about. Show you each of those in turn, and the first one I'd like to show you is an annotation. So let's say I'm reading this particular PDF and I get to this paragraph and I think, gosh, hang on a minute, I have got that Davidson item or PDF in my project. I don't remember Davidson actually making that particular point. So I want to make a note about that at this point to remind me to go back and double check that later. So I've highlighted that citation there and I'm going to right click and I've got an option here, new annotation. So annotations are kind of like putting a post-it note on a hard copy of an article or perhaps a margin note down the side. So I'm going to say need to check this article again. Probably put something slightly more eloquent if I was doing this for real, but that will do for today. So I've made that little note to myself, and if I now click back into the PDF, you'll see that I get a blue highlight showing. So wherever you see a blue highlight in NVivo, that represents something called an annotation, and that tells me that there's a little note attached to that piece of text. Now, as you can probably imagine, if you are using NVivo for a lit review, that ability to add extra notes to the file will be incredibly useful. Now, the other example of a link that I wanted to show you was making a connection within the project. And as I have just hinted at when I made this annotation, we actually do have the Davidson article itself, the original article, in our project. And if I come over to that list view here, I can actually see that sitting there. So it could be that I actually want to connect the citation to the item itself. Now, I could do that on the same citation that I added the annotation to, but that will get a little bit confusing. So as luck would have it, I've got the Davidson citation repeated just down here. So what I'm wanting to do here is connect that citation to the actual article. So I'm going to right-click here, got an option for links, and the type of link I'm creating is a See Also link. I'm going to find that article, so I'm just clicking on select, and we've got it there. And I've now got a pink highlight. So there are 3 different colours of highlights in NVivo, blue, pink and yellow. You can see a couple of those examples here. So a pink highlight represents a See Also link. And if I was reading this article and I saw that particular link, then I can see the item down below here and I can double click on it and that will open it up and take me to that item. So I think those 2 abilities of linking within your NVivo projects can add a lot of value to your thinking and writing processes with a literature review. Just a word of warning, I think linking in NVivo is really useful. It's also a great way to procrastinate. So I think you can get very carried away linking within your project without actually getting any useful work done. So do watch out for that. Well, this is us now up to the point of coding. And coding literature in NVivo is probably my favourite reason for using NVivo for lit reviews. My plan is I'm going to show you the beginnings of some coding in this project, and then I'm actually going to switch into a project where the coding's completed for these journal articles, and that way you'll be able to see what that will look like. Now, in order to do that, I'm just going to come here to the Nodes folder in my project. So for those of you that are new to NVivo, Nodes is a bit of jargon for you. Nodes are containers that hold data. Now, usually your nodes in an NVivo project represent the codes that you're using for your qualitative data analysis. So you create the nodes, they're almost like containers or boxes, as I've said, and you store your coding within them. In the context of this lit review project, the data that you store in nodes will actually be the text that has come from your journal articles, book notes, and so on. In terms of what your nodes might be, you can see some examples on screen at the moment. They could be things like key concepts, categories, or keywords from the literature. For me personally, I like to be thinking towards my actual write-up that I will be doing for my lit review. So my nodes and my subnodes within my NVivo project would most likely be my headings and subheadings that may eventually end up in my written review. Now let's just take a quick look at the examples you can see on my screen. The two nodes at the top are standard nodes that I have in all of my lit review projects. Great quotes is for anything that I think I might want to include as a direct quote in my review. What I would be doing as I'm coding is coding at great quotes, and I would also code to whatever topic that particular quote relates to. So it might be a great quote, and it's also to do with the practicalities of working with transcribers, for instance. When I complete my write-up, NVivo has a really neat query function called a coding query that will allow me to see everything that's coded at a particular topic, if it's also coded at great quotes. And so it's a very quick way for me to identify anything that I might want to include in my write-up. So that was the great quotes node here. The other one I like to include is definitions, which is just a place for me to put any really excellent definitions that I come across about my topic. So if I was reading an article and they had a great definition of what transcription is, I would code that at my node for definitions. Well, let's see coding in action, and then we'll switch across to this completed project so that you can see what that would look like. Now, I am going to open up that Davidson article that we were just talking about. Just going to scroll to about the halfway point. This is what I'm after. Just going to show you two ways of coding in NVivo. There are a number of different techniques that can be used, but as this is just a demonstration and we're keeping it quite simple, I'm just going to show you a couple before we switch to the completed project. So the first technique I'd like to cover is a very simple drag and drop. So this chunk of text here, this paragraph, is obviously to do with transcribers. And you can see here that I have a node specifically for that purpose. So I want to take this paragraph and store it or code it at the box that I've created for transcribers. So to do that, I hover over the text, I click and hold, and I pull over to that transcribers node. And if I let go, you can see I've done coding there. I've got one file and one reference has been coded. Just to show you what that looks like in the node, it's not very exciting because we've only got one chunk of text there. You can see that that appears there, and I can also see whereabouts it came from. That will look much more impressive on the completed project, so bear with me there. Now, if I didn't have a node for transcribers, I could still have used drag and drop, and what I'd be doing is just dragging it to this white area here, and it would ask me to provide a new name for the node. Now, another way to do that is to code via a right click. So I'm just going to highlight this particular paragraph, and I would like to code this at a node for technology. Fortunately, I don't have a node for technology at this point, so I'm going to have to make a node and do the coding at the same time. So I'll right-click over top and choose the code option. And technology, I think, relates to practicalities, so I'd like to make it underneath that. And I'll click this New Node button. I'll type the name in for it and click OK. And so what you can hopefully see off on the side here, I've got a brand new node called Technology. You can also see here that it's done the coding for me. So the actual process of coding in NVivo is pretty straightforward once you know how. Obviously NVivo doesn't remove the need for you to go through your journal articles and read and process the information, but it certainly with these nodes provides a really helpful storage place to help you organize things. Well, on that note, I'm going to jump across to the completed project. And you can see what it looks like when you have lots of coding at a project. So we have a lot more nodes here. We've actually got 23 nodes that have been created. And you can see from the numbers that are showing here that there's been a decent amount of coding done. We only had a small number of files, but they have been coded across these topics and subtopics. Now, to show you what one of these nodes would look like if you had done a decent amount of coding at them, I'm just going to open up benefits of transcription here. And if you imagine that you were perhaps doing your write-up and you wanted to summarize what the literature said about the benefits of transcription, you would just have everything in one place. It's all coded at the box or the node for you. You could read through what was said about that particular topic and you could summarize it in your text. So it's not going to do the reading for you, it won't do the writing for you either, but it's certainly going to give you a very clever and sensible way of storing the various topics that are discussed in the literature. Now, in terms of just a couple of things that I quite like when I'm viewing the contents of a node, one thing is that I can very easily go back to where this text occurred. So if I am looking at this particular text and I think, gosh, I'm wondering what was actually said either side of this particular paragraph, I can actually right-click, and there's an option here, Open Referenced File. What that's doing here is it's actually opened up the Grundy article, and I can see that particular chunk of text highlighted in context. So that's quite a useful thing to be doing when you're reviewing the contents of your nodes. The other thing that can be quite helpful, I'm just going to take that highlight off for a moment. When you are looking over a particular PDF and you're thinking, gosh, I wonder what I've coded where, there is a very handy coding stripes option. And if I select that, the options at the top here give me various ways to display coloured stripes on the file, but they can be a little bit hard to read in this webinar format. So I'm just going to come down and choose Coding Density Only. And what that's doing is giving me a little bar down the side, and if I hover over anything that's shaded, I can actually see here exactly where that chunk of text has been coded. So these lines have been coded at benefit of transcription. This line here has been still coded at benefits and also at challenges. So it's always possible to review an article in its entirety and look at what you've coded where. Now I wanted to do a couple more things with the remaining time we have. One is to talk about classifications and how they can be used in queries, and also talk about how you might link NVivo with your reference management software. But before I talk about how classifications and queries work in NVivo, I do just need to jump back to my slides for a moment, and I've just got two very quick slides to cover here, just talking about what classifications are and how they work. So in terms of what classifications are in NVivo, they're a way of assigning demographic or descriptive information to your sources. So if you have a project that's based on primary data such as interviews, the information you assign via classifications might be things like the gender or age group of your participants. In a literature review project, it would obviously be descriptive information that relates to your journal articles and your books. So a couple good examples would be year of publication, or maybe the country that the author originates from. Now, the only reason you would want to have that in NVivo is if you wanted to be able to ask questions about the coding that you've done. So let's say, for example, you're researching a particular topic. You know there are different schools of thought in Australasia compared to the US. If you tell NVivo what country each of your articles originated from, that means you can actually split your coding down by country, and you can look at how the different articles reported on that particular topic. Now, classifications are a reasonably complex tool in NVivo, so I'm not going to explain them in detail here or talk you through exactly how to use them in the software. But I do want to give you a bit of a feel for how they work in a lit review project. So in order to do that, I'm just going to talk about the different levels that classifications have. So at the very top level when we're talking about classifications is the classification name. And the best example of that in a lit review project is reference. You are labeling your pieces of literature as references. Underneath that, you have something called an attribute. And here are a couple examples of attributes: year of publication and also the country of origin. And then the third level down would be the more specific values that those attributes can take. So the various years of publication and the various countries that the authors are from. Now, it's you that determines this for your project, so you can include whatever might be useful for the kinds of literature that you are working with. Now, you can create classifications directly within the software, but our preference is actually to bring across something called a classification sheet. So you can actually set this kind of information up in Excel, and then you can bring it across into NVivo from there. We just find that's a more effective way of working with this information. Now, the sample project we're looking at today already has these details set up, but I did just want to talk you through what we have here. So you've obviously got the classification, which is that top level I've just shown you. We've got the details of the attributes, and we've also got the actual attribute values. And when you bring a table like this into NVivo, it matches those details up with each of the pieces of literature that you have in your project. Now, as I said before, this is a hugely complex topic, and I've just covered it in about 2 minutes. There is lots of details on the QSR International website about classifications. They are the folk that make NVivo, and we also do have other training courses we offer here at Academic Consulting. But let's actually see this in the NVivo project, just so you can get a sense for where they sit. So classifications are just here. They're stored alongside your files in NVivo 12. In NVivo 11, they have their own area. And I'll just show you what that table looks like. So it's got an extra column for journal that wasn't on the slide, but essentially all of that other information is in here. So we've classified these journal articles with the attributes that relate to each one. Unfortunately, NVivo is a little bit jargon heavy, so my apologies to those of you that are new. Those of you that are familiar with the software will already be familiar with that terminology. Now, more importantly though, I wanted to show you how to use this. So this particular project, the coding has been done, as you've seen. We've also got these attributes all set up. So let's use these attributes. One of the columns in this particular sheet is to do with the discipline that the author has come from. So I'm interested in looking at discipline across the nodes that are to do with transcription quality. So we've got 4 sub-nodes or child nodes here to do with transcription quality issues. So what I can do here is run something called a matrix coding query, and I've actually set one up ready to go just to save us a little bit of time. So matrix coding queries can only be done when you've finished your coding and you've got these classifications set up. But as you will hopefully see, it's well worth the effort to do that, just based on the really useful information that it gives you. So what we're looking at here, we've got a table that this query has presented us, and we've got the various disciplines are represented in the rows. And in the columns here, we've got the codes or the nodes. And this is a really useful way to look for patterns in your data. I can immediately see that there was a fair bit of talk about errors. And I might want to look in a little bit more detail here. So it might be that I want to know what the education researchers said about errors. So what I do here is just double click on that number 9 that you see. And this is actually telling me exactly what the education researchers said about that particular topic, i.e. transcription errors. I could read through that, come back to the table, and I might want to compare that with what the accounting folks said. So I can double click on that number there. So once again, matrix coding queries are a reasonably complex tool. Today is about showing you the possibilities only. You would need to brush up your NVivo skills to figure out exactly how to set those up. But I'd be very keen to know what people think of that matrix coding query. If that's something that you think you might find useful in your own lit reviews, send us a quick message to let us know. It's always interesting to get people's reactions to these features. Now, what I've just shown you is an example of a coding query. Let's also show you a quick example of a text query. So I'll just close these down. And I'll pop up to the Explore tab here. I might run this via the wizard, I think. So we've got here the query wizard, and this gives us access to the main 4 queries that can be run in NVivo. I thought I might show you an example of probably one of the more popular queries in NVivo, which is a word frequency query. So what this is essentially going to do is give me a count of the most frequently occurring words in this project, and it's also going to demonstrate it visually for me as well. Now, just a little bit of a tip that you might like to be aware of if you are running these. One of the most common terms in a lit review project is often the year of publication. So just a bit of a tip that it would pay to set the minimum word length. That's the minimum number of characters that are to be included in the word if it's to be counted. If you set that to 5, because years of publication have 4 characters, they will get excluded. Now, because this is just a quick demo, I'm just going to run that. And so what we're looking at here, thankfully transcription was the most commonly used term across those pieces of literature, no surprise there. And we've got research pretty up there and also qualitative. So this can be pretty helpful in terms of you coming up with ideas for those nodes. The other thing I'll just show you before we come out of this, you can ask to see this visually, and this is often pretty popular with people. So this is just showing us the more frequent words in a larger font, and sometimes looking at the information visually as opposed to a list can be quite helpful. Now, last thing to cover in the 5 minutes we have left is linking to reference management software. And I suspect this is possibly the reason some of you attended today. People tend to get quite excited at the thought of linking NVivo to reference management software. Now, in terms of the options for you, if you're interested in this, NVivo is compatible with the 4 main reference management applications: EndNote, Zotero, Mendeley, and RefWorks. Now, if you haven't heard of reference management software and you haven't heard of those 4 applications, I would highly recommend that you investigate them in more detail. They are enormously useful for research. They'll essentially allow you to have your in-text citations formatted correctly. It will keep track of your reference list at the end and format that appropriately as well. And it can obviously be used with NVivo. Now, I'm going to prefix what I'm about to show you by saying that I think a number of you have probably attended today being very excited about this. This isn't a feature I find particularly helpful. So for me personally, I just find it quicker to directly import the PDFs rather than mucking around with reference management software, but that is a personal preference. Now, you are probably all using different applications, and I had to pick one to use today. So I've decided to use EndNote. That still tends to be the most popular choice, but as I've indicated, it's not the only one. So if you are wanting to have this link between your reference management software and NVivo, first thing to do is to select what references you want to import. So I've just got a tiny library here with 10 articles in it. And my first step is actually exporting these. So I'll come up to the File menu. If you are using something other than EndNote, you will need to look up the help files to find out what steps are involved. But I do need to just send this out of EndNote. And I'll then pop back across to NVivo. Now, what I think I'll do is I'll do the import and we'll talk about what it does. And I'm also just heading towards 2 o'clock. So if you have any questions you were hoping to ask during the session, if you could get typing with those, that would probably be a very good idea. So what I'm doing here is just saying that I would like to import from EndNote. Going to pick the file, and I'll leave all of the defaults as is here and click Import. Now, those of you familiar with EndNote might have noticed, if I jump back across for a moment, I had PDFs attached to each of these. So that little paperclip there indicates that the full text PDFs were linked. And because of that, all of those PDFs from my EndNote library have actually come across into NVivo. If I open one up for a look, you can see what I mean. So this was an EndNote and it's been imported across to NVivo. The other thing that's quite neat here, there is a little memo attached to one of the PDFs, and if I open that up, anything that is stored in the Notes and Abstract field will also come across and appear as a linked memo within your project. Now, you're probably sitting there wondering why on earth I don't like this, because that did look pretty neat. One of the reasons I'm not a huge fan of it, if I come back to classifications here, we've got the little set of classifications that I made earlier, but it's also done a duplicate classification sheet, and you can see there's a whole heap of different kinds of reference information that's come across from EndNote. And I don't find having this sort of thing, particularly things like the ISBN number and the DOR number, don't find having those in NVivo particularly helpful. Right, folks, that is dead on 2 o'clock. I only just sneaked that last topic in on time. For those of you that do need to head off to another meeting or another commitment, you are welcome to head off now if you'd like. The way to exit the session is to click on the cross in the top right corner of the control panel. But otherwise, I'd love to take any final questions that you have. Very conscious that that was a very quick tour. Remember, it was a demonstration of how you might set up an NVivo Lit Review project. Wasn't designed to be a how-to, but it's hopefully given you a few ideas that you can incorporate into your own projects. Okay, let's just see what sort of questions are coming in. And remember, folks, we have officially reached our finish time, so I will take any extra questions if you can stay online, but otherwise you are welcome to head off. So I've been asked a question by Evelyn around, I don't have a PDF initially and would like to add that at a later time. Is that possible? Absolutely. You can add information such as PDFs or anything else, in fact, at any stage of the project. So NVivo is a very flexible system. You don't have to have everything set up at the outset. You can add things as you go. Any other questions from folks? I can see there's still just a follow-up question from Evelyn. I think maybe your question was around, can you then link it to the classification of reference that you've set up? Yes, that's absolutely correct. So that's just a sort of double-step process, unfortunately. You'd have to go back and say this particular PDF has a classification of reference, but that's very straightforward to do. Any other final questions you'd like to ask, pick our brains about? I did notice a number of questions throughout, people asking if they can get hold of a copy of NVivo through their institution. It will depend on where you're enrolled or where you're working, but most New Zealand universities will give you access to NVivo as a staff member or student. If you're not at a New Zealand university, you'll need to ask around and find out what the story is. Certainly a fair few overseas universities as well will give people access to it. Well, I'm not seeing any other questions come through, so just a reminder, if you would like to review any of the content, given the quite fast pace we went at, that would be very understandable. You are able to have a look at the recording, and that will be sent round about an hour after today. And the other thing, just to remind everyone, we have lots of training courses that you can enroll in, and also we've still got a number of free webinars available for 2018. So you are welcome to enroll in those. We'd love to see you online. Okay, I think we'll wind up there, folks. It looks like most of the questions have come through. So if we can be of any assistance with your NVivo projects, don't hesitate to get in touch with us. Otherwise, I wish you all the best for using NVivo for your own lit reviews.